Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the fifth live stream organized by NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence. And this time we are going to focus on the discussion on and focusing on Russia's presence in southern eastern part of Europe and especially Western Balkans. A few weeks ago, the StratCom Center of Excellence published the study, which was called Russia's Footprint in the Western Balkan Information Environment. The objectives and the focus of the study was analyzing Russia's strategic interests and tools of influence in the region, and with particular focus on the Russia's activities in the media landscape of the Western Balkans. Why we decided to look at Russia's role in the Western Balkans? Basically, we all know that there are several foreign actors that have influence in the region. However, Russia, nobody else has actually demonstrated such interest and capability to interfere in domestic matters of other countries. And particularly in regards to their foreign policy preferences. During the study, we also didn't want to focus only on disinformation or information campaigns only, so we wanted to look wider at it and also try to understand what are the structural vulnerabilities, why Western Balkan countries might be susceptible to hostile foreign influence. Today, we are going to present the key findings of the study and discuss some of the pressing issues which came out of the conclusions of the study. And with this, I would like to introduce both distinguished speakers, Professor Dimitar Bechev, Research Fellow at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Milan Jovanović, researcher from the Atlantic Council of Montenegro. I would like to give a floor to Dimitar Bechev at first, and I would like you to explore, tell us more about what Russia would want to achieve in Western Balkans and what is in its tool set to achieve their interests there. So, and before I give a floor to Dimitar, I also would like to remind our dear audience, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them on our comment section on our Facebook live screen. So, Dimitar, could you tell us more about Russia's interest in the Western Balkans?
Hi, Sandra, and hello to everyone who is watching us. It's a pleasure to be part of this session in these difficult times. And I would also like to thank the NATO StratCom Center for hosting us and for being in charge of this excellent project that has added to our knowledge and understanding of the region, but also Russia's actions in this part of Europe. So what is Russia up to in the Western Balkans, but also more broadly in Southeast Europe? Well, what I want to say at the outset is that Russia doesn't really have a grand strategy. Many people thinking about the Russian presence these days, but also historically, are tempted to make the claim that it's the same policy over centuries, that Russia is connected to the Balkans, to places like Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and elsewhere by virtue of culture, language, religion. So Russia is bound to be part of the landscape. I take a bit more nuanced approach, looking mostly at the post-Cold War era. And in a spirit of shameless self-promotion, I wrote a book 3 years ago about Russia's role in Southeast Europe. What I see is that ultimately Russia's approach to the Balkans is a function of its relationship with the West. At times when relations with the West are cooperative or, let's say, pragmatically cooperative, Russia is more or less moving along with the Western policy. At times, like in the past, nearly a decade, certainly after 2014, the annexation of Crimea, at times of conflict, Russia sees the Balkans as a soft underbelly of the Western alliance, a place it can project influence and make life difficult for Western actors, NATO, but also the EU, where you have a number of vulnerabilities at the level of society, politics, and the economy, and you could essentially push forward all those initiatives and policies aimed at spoiling the Western vision, more or less. Well, that's a bit more abstract, but let's just make it more direct. Western policy in the region for the past 20 years, since the Kosovo War at least, but also before, I guess, is based on enlargement, that the Western Balkans, former Yugoslavia, should become part of EU, but also NATO. Russia doesn't really have a policy comparable to that. In other words, you don't envision, even in the wildest dreams of nationalist politicians or great Russian visionaries sitting in the Kremlin, that Serbia or any other of its neighbors will be joining the Eurasian Economic Union or the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And Russia is not certainly prepared to pay for those countries to maintain them and to play a role comparable to that of the EU over the long term. But what Russia can do is just create obstacles and score points against the West in the hope of leveraging special relations to actors in the Western Balkans, starting from governments all the way to business interests and also social societal groups and political parties to gain geopolitical leverage vis-a-vis the West. The thinking is very simple. If the West is meddling in our backyard, in Georgia, in Moldova, certainly in Ukraine as well, we can pretty much do the same in a region that is more or less already part of the West by virtue of geography. If you look at the map, former Yugoslavia is surrounded by member states of the EU, and NATO is increasingly present, taking one country after the other. Montenegro having joined in 2017, and now pretty much North Macedonia having joined as well. So there's no other credible alternative by being part of the West. But at the same time, Russia is always there in one shape or the other, trying to slow down the process, create disruption, and also interfere at various levels, certainly in the domestic politics. So that's my first point, that Russia is obstructionist, but doesn't really have a long-term plan. And it's on and off when it comes to the Western Balkans. My second point is that it's a two-way street. It's not just that Russia is interfering, but also local actors are proactively engaging Russia. And that's been the case certainly since the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. Governments, individual leaders, political and economic groups have interest and motivation to work with Russia, and by Russia that might mean anything from the Russian state, and because boundaries are fuzzy, all the way to various fellow travelers, again, oligarchic networks, various nationalist entrepreneurs who want to push Russian policy and then sell it back to the Kremlin. So also Russian actors are allies for local players who wish to maximize their economic interests, but also outmaneuver their domestic rivals, and very often try to enhance their power vis-a-vis neighbors and the West. There is no clearer example than, again, I'll bring up Serbia as the largest country in the region, than President Vučić, who, by everyone's agreement, has become the dominant player in Serbian politics. So he's been leveraging the connection to Russia, not to steer the country away from the West, but to strengthen its or his personal, because it's almost a sign of it's almost equal to state interest to enhance his power vis-a-vis Brussels, meaning the EU, but also the US. Russia, he's playing off one against the other. And that's a behavior you see quite a bit, not just in the Balkans, but also, I'd say, in Eurasia. And again, Russia sometimes helps those players because it's suitable. Sometimes it keeps a distance from those players. Sometimes those bargains work, sometimes as in Montenegro, they don't. And lastly, and I think we'll dwell on this issue later on in the Q&A, this behavior, Russia against the West, is getting a bit more complicated because there are other players. We see it now with COVID-19, where Serbia has reached out also to China. So it's a multi-vector game and not one played between Russia and the West these days. So let me stop here and then we'll come back into the discussion, I guess.
Dimitar, may I ask you a question? So how do you see how this Russia's modus operandi or the activities or toolset in regards to Western Balkans, how it differs from what Russia does in other regions? So do you see any differences in there?
One clear difference when you compare the Western Balkans to the post-Soviet space is that Russia is much less willing to use hard power, military, to coerce. Other forms of softer coercion might be at play, working through domestic political actors, through asymmetric means. Again, I think we'll be discussing the coup attempt in Montenegro or the scandal involving Russian proxies. But Russia is not willing to send its troops to the region. And that's a difference not just compared to, say, the Caucasus, or Central Asia, or indeed Ukraine, but also in comparison to the 1990s, because again, many of our viewers will surely remember the Yugoslav wars when Russia actually did have boots on the ground. It had a contingent in Bosnia, and at the time it was quite weak by comparison to today. It dispatched in June 1999 one of its battalions, it was a lesser unit, sent troops from Bosnia to Kosovo in a surprise move to put NATO before a fait accompli. So that's a thing of the past. Putin was the person who decided that that's done, and that's a difference. What is similar? Well, other tools are pretty similar to what you have elsewhere. First of all, using energy. Russia is not an important economic player in the region, apart from several sectors, and energy is certainly one of those. And by energy, it's mostly oil and gas, because it's a larger discussion about the energy sector in the Western Balkans. And there Serbia plays a particular role by coopting local political plans and oligarchic interests. Russia has established a foothold in the Serbian energy sector, which means that over the longer term, whatever the weather in diplomatic relations, Russia has a stake and potential leverage through its companies. First and foremost, Gazprom Neft, but also the gas branch of Gazprom and other business ventures like Lukoil. So that's one continuity you see across many places, that energy is a big tool of influence. Secondly, I'd say you see Russia's presence in the information space. I guess Milan can say more about that. What is different from other places is that in the Balkans, I guess, the two-way street phenomenon kicks in. The most influential media spreading the Russian narrative in the region are not necessarily those directly backed by Russia. I think they are media channels and outlets that are beholden to local elites, local interests, who have interests to work with Russia and therefore to spread the Russian message to the very receptive audience. So it's an alliance of convenience. And we can discuss later the reasons why they do so. So it's not the Russian media necessarily, it's the pro-Russian media. But again, what matters is the fact that it's pretty much similar. So Russian line on the decadent West, US being this arrogant bully, acting against the peoples of the region, being the villain since the 1990s and so on and so forth. This message is being repeated time and again. And of course, it's not only against NATO and the US, but also against the EU. That's something that happened increasingly over the past 10 years, that the EU is being insensitive, at times arrogant, and willing to victimize the region as a whole.
Thank you, Dimitar, for a very good overview of Russia's interests and also toolset and areas where it might be influential. I will give floor now to Milan, because as we have started to talk about more practical activities and areas where Russia is present, we are moving more to its activities in media space. And Milan and his team from Atlantic Council of Montenegro actually made a very comprehensive study by analyzing content of one of the most known and also one of the most popular Kremlin-funded media, which is Sputnik, in Serbian language. And although Sputnik Serbia is not amongst the most popular media outlets in the region, according to different statistics and etc., still it's gaining traction via local medias, which are quite often also republishing Sputnik's content. But I will give floor to Milan to talk more about that and the activities of Sputnik Serbia and the way how they present the content. So Milan, please.
Well, thank you, Sandra. And first of all, thank you for having us here today. It's been an honor to work on a project of such a scale. And I'm more than happy to share the results today with everyone who's watching. So basically, in my opinion, if you would like to analyze Russian influence in any part of the world, Western Balkans included, one of the best ways to do so is by analyzing their media that are being, backed by the state. Lucky for us, we have a Sputnik outlet here based in Belgrade, which is their newsroom for the region. And for the past 4 years, Sputnik has been pushing a lot of different content on Serbian language. The thing about the Western Balkans, even though that we speak different languages or variations, we can pretty much understand all countries can understand each other. And that's a big plus for Sputnik because its audience is not only in Serbia, its audience is all across the Western Balkans. And that's something that makes the life of us who, debunk disinformation and fake news much more, harder than it should be. So basically, a lot of regional and local fact checkers have said that Sputnik is one of the biggest promoters and producers of fake news in the same time. But the content that we actually analyzed here left that aside. We mainly focused on narratives, first of all, identifying narratives that Sputnik pushed, and then bringing them to the surface, to explore them further. So the whole research was conducted between January 1st of 2018 up to December 31st of the same year. So during the 1 year, we have read and analyzed more than 11,000 of articles that came from Sputnik that are in contact or connected to the 6 Western Balkan countries, plus NATO, plus EU. So we have collected a lot of different narratives, which is to be expected when you deal with 11,000 articles, but we structured them into 9 main narratives. So this, when Dimitar was talking about the way that Russia plays in the region, I was like thinking about all the narratives that were passing through my head that that resemble a lot to what we did here. So first of all, Western Balkans is presented as a playground for the clash of interest between West and the East, where West is presented like, let me use the phrase, a big bad wolf that goes against the interest of the people of the Western Balkans, while the Russia, on the other hand, is presented as a savior of orthodoxy and Serbians in the same time. Then Western Balkans is presented as an unstable region that has a lot of ethnic tensions, that there is a lot of border disputes, especially they're trying to send a message that the region is not safe. And also that the countries are weak and corrupt. When I say countries, I mean all the countries except for Serbia, that is portrayed as a role model, as a country that all other Western Balkan countries should look upon to and behave like Serbia does. On the other hand, when we talk about NATO and the EU, they're presented like weak and not united. There are a lot of internal affairs with sanctions, issues with Turkey back in 2018, and tariff things against Russia. So these are all the things that Sputnik mentions, claiming that EU and NATO are not united and they will probably disintegrate. When we talk specifically about NATO, NATO is presented like an aggressive and provocative organization. Why? Because first of all, it wants to expand near Russia across the countries that share the border with Russia, and on the other hand, NATO is organizing military exercises alongside the borders with Russia. So Russia thinks, or Sputnik thinks this way, that this is a clear provocation. And when we talk about like more specific narratives regarding the countries in the Western Balkans, then we have like the human rights are under threat, meaning that Serbs or Serb minorities in the region across like in Montenegro, in Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia are endangered, and no one respects Serbs in these countries. So this is like the message that Sputnik, and when I say Sputnik, I usually mean Russia because it's state-owned, and no, it's kind of the same. And last but not least is the narrative that is specific to Montenegro, and it's about that Montenegro wants to rewrite the history. Those who know like a little bit of history of the Western Balkans know that in 1918, there happened like a big historical event called Podgorica Assembly, where Montenegro's independence was forcefully denied, and Montenegro joined with Serbia that later became, Yugoslavia. So now Sputnik wants to present that unity or union back in the day was willingly, that was the will of the people and was not forced. So there are a lot of things that Sputnik actually exploits. When I go all through all the narratives, I actually think that Sputnik exploits regional problems and uses it to promote Russian interest for their own gain. When we go over all the articles, what we found in general is that Sputnik behaves like a professional media. Like they mostly report on they mostly do reports, and they do neutral stance on the articles. But if you dig deeper, then you can find a lot of things, just what I've talked about. Like all the pro-Western countries are portrayed as full of corruption, like with a lot of crime in there. While on the other hand, Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Serbia are presented like a more, role model that every other country should follow. So the tone of the report and the messages that are being sent correspond with the official stance and the official messages that are coming from Kremlin itself. So as we when we finish this, we made the little saying, so read Sputnik and know what Kremlin thinks. This is like a saying within the team after everything we have done and analyzed here. So that's it from me for this first, part, and we can take more on it during the Q&A session.
So Milan, one of our studies within this project actually identified how often actually different narratives coming from Sputnik and Sputnik's content is republished also by local media, and especially in BCMS languages, which is Bosniak, Montenegrin, Serbian, Croatian languages. So could you explain what are the main reasons for that? Why the content offered by Sputnik, by this Kremlin-funded media, is so attractive to local media? Is it, are we talking about some internal structural organizational vulnerabilities, or is it more like editorial policy which is pleasing to Russian narratives, or is it Russia's image which is very well perceived in the country? So could you give more elaboration on that? What could be the main reason why Kremlin narratives can actually reach wider audiences, and not only in Serbian languages but also in other languages across the borders in the Western Balkans?
Yeah, definitely. So there is first there is a huge difference between the media outlets across the Western Balkans region. So Sputnik is being mostly shared, reproduced by pro-Russian and pro-Serbian media, like the pro-government media in Serbia and Republika Srpska. So these are, if you want, you can go to all the websites there, and in 90% these are like pro-Russian like portals that share Sputnik content, and Sputnik is one of the main sources of theirs. But in the other countries, that's not the case. For instance, here in Montenegro, we have 3 or 4 pro-Russian portals. One of them is, really popular, and we are aware of that. But on the other hand, in other previously mentioned countries, I like to think, and I'm sure of it, that actually the media is following political elite and their foreign policy, stance. So there is a clear correlation with the foreign policy goals of certain countries and the dominant media in this very country. If you look, for instance, Serbia or Republika Srpska, you can clarify on that. But if you look some other pro-Western countries like Montenegro, like Bosnia, like Albania, you can see the clear difference. But the fact is that no matter how small or big the public is that read pro-Russian content, being Sputnik or some other local news outlets, the thing is that Russia is using it to promote its own values and to undermine democracy and free thinking here in the Western Balkans. And it's not just specific to the Western Balkans, I would say it's the problem of every other country where some Russian media is present. It's just that they use the specifics of the very region in order to convey a certain message. But the end goal is very the same.
And another conclusion, what was taken out of the study is that basically actually also people, the local audiences actually are not aware that they are reading content which is coming from Kremlin media, Kremlin-sponsored media, also because not all media are sourcing their information sources, not all of them are referring to information source, and actually people are just reading the content which has no source or anonymous source, and nobody can actually understand where it comes from. So maybe you can comment on that as well. What are the reasons for that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the main problem, is that there is a lack of media literacy. It's a thing, that's a problematic all over the world, that people cannot tell the difference between good quality media that reports with facts and other media that promotes someone's interest and someone's opinions and someone's analysis. So that's the first thing. The other thing that comes to my mind is that people usually believe things and media and articles that go well with their political bias. So if someone has like Russia more close to himself than the West, he of course will read Sputnik, no matter who the author is, will read some other fringe media in the region that are also pro-Russian, pro-Serbian. And that's the problem. No one will ask, the people will not ask, who's the author, why am I reading this, or will not critically think about what they read. They will just consume and let it be there. So I think that one of the main problems, not when we talk about Russia, but any other actor spreading disinformation and fake news around the world, is critical thinking and media literacy. That's something that the countries in the Baltics have done a great job on by putting media literacy in schools. That's something I think good practice that other countries should look upon and do the same. And one more thing that I would like to add here is that disinformation campaigns and media outlets that are pushing them are not just there to convey people to believe into something. That's just one part of the job. The other thing is to undermine the trust in the good old media and undermine democracies around the world. And I think we can all agree upon that. Thank you.
Thank you, Milan, for that. I just wanted to, go to the current state of affairs, where we are currently in some kind of weird situation and in a pandemic mode. And I would like to pose the question to both of you. Have you noticed how Russia has used actually pandemic to boost its image in the Western Balkans? How do you evaluate its actions and also maybe its media presence in regards to current situation and the aid it has provided to the regional countries? Maybe Dimitar, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Russia, of course, took on this opportunity, but I think that it's not its strong suit for a number of reasons. First of all, other players have been much more prominent, starting with China, which, for obvious reasons, was very keen to burnish its international image. And there was this opening in Serbia. So China was an early arrival. And then you had Turkey, and ultimately now the EU with the big aid package that they unveiled. in the run-up of the virtual Zagreb summit, but also at the summit itself. So the crowd, the field is crowded, and there's not that much space for Serbia, for Russia. Having said that, Russia did send assistance to Serbia, but also Republika Srpska. And that's something that is not new, because humanitarian aid has been used over a longer period of time. What comes to mind is 2014, the big floodings across the Western Balkans, when Russia was very prominent, sending emergency assistance, but also crews, and using the infrastructure it has on the ground, the Niš humanitarian center. So it did its core point earlier on, and I tried to do a bit more of that, but there was not that much wavelength for Russia. And secondly, the other point that Russia hasn't been very successful in taking mileage out of the crisis is that its own efforts have not very successful at home. Right? I mean, China had a story to tell, a narrative that it was an early victim of the pandemic, but because of its efficient state and its governance model, it managed to get its act straight and contain the spread of the disease. And now it's going out into the world, including the Western Balkans and Serbia, exporting, showing it goodwill, exporting public goods, but also ways of doing it. I don't think Russia has a story to tell. And just to open a parenthesis, the Chinese story might be problematic in itself, and it's a separate conversation. But certainly Russia is grappling with the crisis, is getting worse by the day. Putin is absent. He has abdicated from managing the situation. He's delegated to regional authorities, to governors. It's a big holy mess right now in Russia, and that kind of impedes Russia from telling a story. I mean, most you can do, going back to the information space, is just to expose how pathetic are the Western efforts, but it's not enough. You have to have a positive message as well, which is much better. I mean, China has been doing a better job in undermining the West, but also trying to put together and disseminate a narrative about its own model and governance efforts.
Thank you. Milan, do you have anything to add? What have you seen in media and social media, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would completely agree with Dimitar, because even though both China and Russia try to tell their story in a quite similar way, China did it much better and much more effective. And they all try, to share the story of countries that successfully dealt with a huge problem around the world that no other country can currently solve. And by doing that, they continued to send the help, medical, supplies and medical stuff, not just to Serbia, but other countries of the region. I think Russia sent the stuff to Republika Srpska and also to Serbia, while China helped all other countries of the region. I think when it comes to information sphere regarding this help of the specific two countries, the situation hadn't changed much, in a way that the same actors spreading these kind of narratives are still doing so, but one much more successful than the other one. The thing that I've seen and that has changed dramatically is the amount of conspiracy theories that people believe in. I think that this whole corona crisis thing is still unknown to many people, and not just to the common people, but to experts. They still, argue on a daily basis, no, this is right, no, you don't get it, the other thing is right, and people are confused by everything. So people run to conspiracy theorists, where they try to simplify the whole situation and starting to believe in those conspiracy theories, which is a huge problem, not just here, but everywhere around the world. So the same actors that have been doing it are still doing it, but they're joined by conspiracy theorists, and that has become a great thing and problem, which it's a question for another time and another conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Milan. With this, I think we can move a bit away from pandemic right now, and I will open the floor for questions from audience. And we have a question which is related to Russia and China, actually, and I think perhaps it's a question to Dimitar. What is Russian perspective on Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and would they try to do something about that and match that with their own investments?
In the Balkans or more generally?
I suppose the question is very general, but you can maybe talk about both, like in general and also more specific in the Balkans.
Well, I'm not the greatest of experts on Russian-Chinese relations, which is a huge topic and has many dimensions to it. But right now, Russia is taking a backseat and not pushing back against the Chinese expansion, which is very visible in Central Asia, and that's where it hurts probably the most. Other regions, Russia doesn't have so great a stake, whereas in its near abroad, the rising Chinese profile has political implications. Russia doesn't have the same firepower, doesn't have the same amount of resources, and I don't think it can match the Chinese economic and diplomatic effort on this level. And that's very much the case in the Western Balkans. China has the soft loans and the money, which will be even in higher demand now with the coming crisis. Why is it that in the last decade, the Chinese financial assistance became so topical, not just in the Balkans, but also in post-communist Europe as a whole, because the economic downturn created this opening for the Chinese. Secondly, China is more competitive to the Russians because something Milan mentioned. It's present everywhere. Pro-Western countries are equally open to cooperation with China as those who balance, Serbia being the case, between Russia and the West. Because China doesn't have a high political profile, it doesn't mess with sensitive issues of security in the region. For instance, Kosovo. Right, we know that China is opposed to Kosovo's independence, and that's been the case from the very start. But it doesn't stick its neck out, and it's not stirring the pot. It's not taking political risks, and it's not being very vocal on the issue, be it at the security, the UN Security Council or in various other fora in the region. It's been very pragmatic and working with everyone. And when you combine capabilities and good relations to all kinds of governments across the region, Croatia would be a good example with the projects they have in the Pelješac Peninsula, bringing together EU funding and Chinese loans. When you have this kind of flexible, pragmatic relationship backed by financial resources, then you're going to be a bit more successful over the longer term because you're not taking risks and you're much less controversial. That might change over time, given the alarm over China on both sides of the Atlantic. But thus far, it has worked very well for the Chinese. And now what happens with the COVID-19 crisis just builds on a story that's been going on for years in the region.
Thank you, Dimitar. Just a follow-up question from me. We are talking about Chinese influence, Russian influence, and then there are also some other actors which also have influence in the Western Balkan region. And of course, different foreign actors will come and go, and they will have different tools of how they interfere in other countries, etc. Question is, so what are the most pressing areas? What Western Balkan countries can do themselves to be more resilient to countries which come with perhaps hostile intentions and try to change their decision making and their foreign policy directions and other directions of the country. So what do you see? What should be done about that? And it's a question to both of you, basically.
Shall I start, or maybe Milan can jump in there?
Yeah, well, I can jump in with a quick remark. Well, regarding that, I almost might have, answered the question before. I think that the fight that we're currently dealing with, you know, you have to start it from each individual in every country. You know, I think that first of all, we have to build resilience through building of society, through building inner resilience. So that's the first thing. Like, you cannot expect a huge organization to behave a certain way if individuals within the organization are behaving completely different. So I think first of all, each country should, you know, invest more in education and building resilience through media literacy of each individual here, starting with kids. And then that's investment in the future. And in 10, 20 years, even or less, even, we will have more resilient to society to any foreign, you know, malign influence of that sort.
Thank you.
I think the media sphere, the risk of stepping into Milan's turf is critical. The reasons those malign narratives have foothold in the region is the deficits and the pathologies of media in the region, which have lots of ramifications. For instance, the lack of transparency of ownership structure and the very neat relationship between political elites, business elites, and media. Of course, you could say that's common to many places around the world, and the West is not immune, certainly. But there are regulations and conventions of doing things and a different level of transparency. So in a more benign environment, the Russian narrative or the Chinese narrative or what have you will definitely be there, but there will be another line. There will be other voices, certainly, in the media space. It will be much more pluralistic. The government will be held to account for dealings with foreign powers, and also the public or critical amount of people or segment of society will be much more prepared to examine critically media content. And since we don't have that, since we have this marriage or very cozy relationship between businesses benefiting from government favors and media conglomerates serving those business interests, and ultimately the government is the circle. Whenever gatekeepers decided it's good to have the Russian story inflated, there's nothing to stop them. But you start by breaking the circle, or at least changing the domestic dynamic before you get to step to phase two, thinking about the external projection. So again, that might be a bit vague, but much of the work happens at home. Same applies to the energy sector. Russia is influential because the energy sector is not reformed and not transparent and kind of vulnerable to corruption. If you tackle those structural, or at least make a difference or start thinking about how you shake things up at the domestic level, then those malign players have much lesser opportunity to interfere. Or if they interfere, they will have to compete against other interests and other players. They won't be able to exert this kind of influence they usually have. So this is what I would have to say. Just think about the enabling conditions first and foremost.
Thank you, Dimitar and Milan. And I think those answers also actually answer already one of the questions which were posed by the audience, that NATO has announced the possibility to build a team in North Macedonia to fight Russia's narratives. And the question was, can this help this information, this task force or task team, can they do it alone, or the more comprehensive reforms are needed? And I think your answer already, your explanation already gave the answer to this question. But if you want, maybe one of you want to comment on that? Milan, maybe?
Yeah. Well, in North Macedonia, there are currently, great teams dealing with, colleague of ours dealing with disinformation and malign influence. And I think the NATO team that is supposed to come there will only help with the expertise, and no one can do it alone. That's why cooperation is needed. no country, no matter how big country or small is, you need to do it as a team. That's exactly why NATO is supposedly sending this team to North Macedonia as the newest member, to help them deal with this issue at the same way NATO helped Montenegro deal with this issue not so long ago.
Thank you. I have a few more questions to Milan in regards to Sputnik and Sputnik's role in Western Balkans. And one of them is, so could you explain more what is the main target audience of Sputnik and whom do they support? And another question is how actively actually Sputnik is exploiting the memory of 1999 NATO bombings to discredit the West and promote Russia's defender of the Serbs. And third question is about does Sputnik do high-quality journalism on topics interesting in the region? Or in order to build the trust and gain more influence in the region. So could you comment on those three?
Yeah, definitely. Well, at first glance, Sputnik deals mostly with reports, for not so much with interviews, with opinions or analysis, but mostly with reports. And when you look at it, on the first time, you think, oh wow, it's quality, it's full facts. But then if you start digging deeper into it and actually fact-checking everything that they say, or even they can hide this small piece of disinformation just within a small sentence that no one will actually notice at first, then we have a problem. So to answer your question, at first, it looks like quality, but if you go underneath and dig deeper, then you look upon what Sputnik actually is, or what content they produce. When we go back to the second question about the NATO intervention in 1999, a lot of articles that we actually went on and through during this analysis is about the NATO intervention. So basically, the Sputnik is trying to use this event to discredit the West, and not just discredit the West, in as much as to present Russia as the only one who was trying and willing to help Serbia and other countries affected with this event. So I think besides that, they're trying to discredit the EU and NATO as well. Well, not so much EU as much as NATO, because a big focus of this whole research, the content of the research was being, NATO. So if you ask me, yeah, there's definitely intention of Sputnik, at least from what we've read so far, to discredit the West, especially NATO and EU to some extent. And could you just please repeat the first question?
The first question was about the main target audience of Sputnik. So basically, what do they want to achieve? So who are the readers of Sputnik?
Yeah. So let me just go back to the second question, because I have something else in mind. Every year, actually, not just Sputnik, but all other pro-Russian media across the region is republishing the very same narratives and the very same articles they published last year when the time of the year comes. So basically, for the last 4 or 5 years, we have the same very content being published from the very same media, and that's just trying to further discredit the West and the EU, as I just mentioned before. When it comes to the audience that Sputnik is targeting, of course, in Western Balkans is a deeply divided region, where you have those who are actually openly supporting Russia and seeing seeing President Putin as a role model of every president here, and how the officials should behave. And those are the people that are mainly, focused on Sputnik. And as I mentioned before, no matter how big or small, because it's a fact that some countries have bigger or smaller audience that that go to Sputnik and read what they publish, no matter how small or big the audience is, up to the point, well, it's important that there is audience, so to say, that Sputnik has audience, and since they do have it, they will continue to push this kind of narratives, this kind of content that are done not just this year, but a long time, since 4 years ago, since they came to Belgrade. So Sputnik is really popular here, but I would say that they are not like the most prominent pro-Russian media in the country. Like much more prominent are some local, media sites, outlets that pick up on what Sputnik says and then just reshare it and replace it on their own websites. And there is a lot of, examples starting from Serbia, here in Montenegro as well, and Republika Srpska especially.
Thank you, Milan, for a very a comprehensive explanation. We have another question from audience related to hostile narratives and local actors. And the question is, how strong is the relationship between the local clickbait revenue-driven platforms and in the Balkans and hostile state-driven narratives? Basically, the question is about, so do they somehow cooperate, or is there any correlation or relationship between those two?
I think it will be a great question to someone from Bosnia, because actually they have huge problem with unregistered sites and clickbait sites that were just made, to make profit. Same goes for North Macedonia, and I have a lot of colleagues who have been listening to about this very issue, and this is like top priority of those who deal with this kind of issues. So when we talk about Montenegro specific, I don't see those kind of websites. Serbia, not so much, but as I mentioned, Bosnia and North Macedonia are like perfect, setting for those kind of sites, which is currently running at full scale. As last time I heard, like a few days ago, that there are over 10,000 sites that you cannot find, are untraceable actually, that you cannot find the ownership or anything. So, and these kind of websites are perfect for creating false narratives, for sharing this same content, and you know how it ends, and it's not good.
And if I may add, I suppose this correlation might be the relationship might be very, very strong there. Also because if you have Kremlin media, for example, offering their content for free, and then you have, and especially if they offer attractive content with very nice, bright headlines, then of course it's attractive also for those clickbait web pages to take up the content and just republish it. Dimitar, would you like to comment on this question as well?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is interesting about Sputnik is that there's Sputnik Radio, which provides a free of charge newscast to regional stations in Serbia. So whenever you drive in Serbia, but I guess also close to Serbia's borders, you're bound, and you have the radio on in your car. And mind you, a lot of people get their news that way. You're bound to get the news as presented to you by the Sputnik newsroom. So that's one. Secondly, the tabloids. We shouldn't forget about them and the headlines they generate. I mean, I think they're pretty influential in the Serbian case, but also by extension to neighboring countries. If a story from Sputnik makes its way to the front pages of a tabloid, then it's bound to be on television as well through the news channel, the news emissions on television, and the circle gets close. Because there's not just the online audience, which of course is getting larger and larger in the region, but they're a bit more conventional and more elderly audiences as well that are there and exposed to those narratives through a more kind of historically powerful means of communication. And I don't have the voting data, but my hunch is that these are the people, the television people, as in Russia and elsewhere in the world, and in the West as well. The television watching crowd is much more likely to turn out at the voting booths, and they decide by electing politicians the course of this or that country. So that you can trace then the information space projection of influence to voting behavior, political participation, and then how real life politics kicks in, I guess.
Thank you. Do you want to add something to that, Milan?
No, I would just agree with that, because as we both agreed upon, Sputnik is influential, to transmit the message from Russia to Serbia, but then it gets to a wider audience using tabloids, a lot of tabloids in Serbia. And if tabloid picks something up and publishes it, gives it a catchy headline, it's bound to go to the television. And then a lot of people there and here as well, especially the elderly, still, are more conventional and do watch TV, and they will also pick it up, aside from the ever-growing, new generations that are online all the time.
So there is another question about Russia's influence in the Western Balkan media space, and the question is about, so can we say that basically Russia's media influence appeared only after introduction of Serbian language Sputnik, which was in 2016, if I'm not wrong? Or it has been already gradual steps, for example, acquisition of Politica and maybe some other media outlets, and also can we see any other steps coming from Russia, not only Sputnik, but perhaps there are some presence in social media as well. Can you comment on that?
Well, definitely Russia didn't start meddling into the affairs and being present here only since 2016, because long time ago Russia sees Western Balkans as its influence sphere. So since then, since 2016, it has intensified so much, and with developments and internet and technology, it has gained a lot of potential and a lot of traction here in the Western Balkans. So Russia has been ever present, but now at this very moment, nowadays, in the times we live in, it's not just present by the state-owned media, like through Sputnik or their agency RT and many more, but especially through privately owned tabloids and pro-Russian media in countries like Serbia and Republika Srpska. And when it comes to their presence, which of course those kind of websites and portals do, guarantee that if something is, catchy enough, it will end up on their websites and then later on the TV.
Thank you. So I have, it seems that we don't have any other questions from the audience. No, sorry, there is one. Is there? Can you give any advice how EU could sell stories in a much better way in the region? And it seems that pandemic has made some lessons that some kind of wake-up call in this sense. What can actually EU could more to better sell their stories or their narrative in a better way to the Western Balkans audiences?
So I wouldn't say sell it, because it means that you are trying to do the same thing as the other side is doing, selling their story. I think much better way to put it is to tell the truth, definitely. And, no matter how hard it is, telling the truth is always the best. And I think in the long term, it will definitely, come up. I'm glad to see that all over Europe, there are a lot, more and more, or increasingly, initiatives and teams doing this kind of work, debunking, doing it together and in joint efforts. And I think that in a sooner rather than later, we will have, quite good results with that. But everything, that deals with, disinformation has to start within individual and then grow more into the society. But to repeat, I'm really glad to see, teams like, especially in the Western Balkans, there are a lot of teams doing this, and we are doing it together. And I'm glad to see, that there is actually quite good results on this issue.
And another, I would say this is a follow-up question. So, do you both see that there is actually a market for narratives which are supportive to West? And we are not talking maybe about Albania and North Macedonia or Montenegro, where you already have certain media and also audiences which are very supportive to pro-Western direction. But do we have a market for narrative support of the West, maybe in the countries like Serbia and others in the region?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a market. The problem is that the West and the EU in particular is taken for granted. It's always there, not accepting us, but there is no alternative. So the EU is a fact of life. But going back to your previous question as well, what the EU can do is just talk up its economic assistance. because I think Russia is not a competitor on that scale. People do believe in Serbia and in neighboring countries where you have pro-Russian segments of society that Russia is spending big on the region. That's not the case, and I think EU over the past few years has started highlighting this fact time and again, and they should do more because now the gap will be even more visible in the coming years with the economic crisis. China will be more of a problem there, of course, but EU should shape the narrative around economic assistance and money. And the second thing the EU should do, and that's not easier to say than said than done, is to use political conditionality to tackle the media sector. That's not something that the EU does. Media is a national prerogative. It's not a EU level competence, but it's critical to democratic development in the Western Balkans. So any informal pressure through Brussels or the member states on this level will help, I guess. So the media sector, the media sphere has to be included in the whole EU accession process.
Milan, would you like to add to the latest question?
I would maybe just...
Yeah, question was about, is there actually a market for pro-Western narratives in the region?
Well, definitely there is. And when we talk specifically about, let's say, Serbia, there is, but they're in a small minority. You know, there are a lot of, let's say, bigger initiatives, like, you know, teams like that are doing corruption investigations and are, you know, doing much more things that investigating into Russian malign influence here in the region, but they're not gaining that much attention, not in the media. But definitely there is space for them, you know, to increase their presence in the media if there is a will of the media, but I'm not sure it's going to happen sooner, you know. And there is a really quality work that these guys in Serbia do. It's like a Serbian Bellingcat version, I like to call it. And they publish like weekly great analysis of, you know, corruption, crime, and malign influence, debunking of malign influence of coming from other countries. But as I mentioned, they do not get enough of media space, which is a problem. But definitely, to conclude, there is a market for the Western narratives, definitely.
Thank you, Milan. I have one more question from audience, and I think we should go and answer that. To what degree are international missions like EUFOR Althea in Bosnia and Herzegovina or KFOR in Kosovo are actually targeted by Russian information operations? Are they active information operations against them? Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, definitely. From what I've seen, and it's not just Sputnik that we are talking about. KFOR is constantly under pressure from a lot of, you know, different media from the region, and not just KFOR. It's a body itself, but larger, like NATO is constantly pressured, and therefore you have negative writings on KFOR. And that's not something that's, you know, coming off the ground in the last years. It's actually just increasing over the years, and especially the time of the year when, you know, NATO interventions happen to be commemorated in Serbia and other countries. So to conclude, I would say that not just KFOR itself, but all other, you know, international bodies that came from the West to any country of the region are actually trying to be, you know, presented in a bad manner, so to say.
Thank you, Milan. Dimitar, would you like to add to that?
No, absolutely. I don't have much to say because Milan has been so comprehensive in the coverage. But again, just to start to say that there is supply of disinformation and malign influence, but also there is, unfortunately, a great degree of demand from the region, and that's much more difficult to tackle, I guess.
I would maybe...
Yes?
I would just like to conclude that obviously at the very end, Russia is not satisfied with the Euro-Atlantic integrations and aspirations of the region as a whole, especially of the region that it sees as its, you know, interest sphere. So I think now it's important more than ever that we have EU present here, NATO present here, US present here, you know, to help us, continue with all the democratic build-ups we have here, and not to leave us, not to leave us to not just Russia, but now increasingly present China in the region. And that's something, that's my message for the very end that I would like to send out and point out. I think it's very important to be heard.
Thank you, Milan. Any last points from you, Dimitar, as well? So have you seen any trends on how Russia's influence have actually changed in the Western Balkans? Because you have analyzed this area for a long time. So have you seen that more active EU policy perhaps have changed also the possibilities or potential for Russia to be influential in the region?
Well, Russia is a fact of life. I don't think there is a scenario where Russia will be out of the region. It's just a matter of managing the influence and countering it, containing it. But we have to just live with it and try to maximize the benefit, the good trends in the region. And it won't be easy because it's a difficult period ahead. And it's not just Russia, but also China now part of the equation. So the West is in for a very kind of contested game. Although it has a lot going on for it, again, the EU package, but also NATO security guarantee goes a long way. The landscape is getting more complicated as we speak.
Thank you, Dimitar. Milan, do you want to add to something to it?
No, rather than just say thank you for having us here today. Once again, it's been a pleasure, to talk about these issues, especially share thoughts with Dimitar here today. And yeah, I hope we can see each other soon at some other conversation, talk about maybe China or something else, of the interest for not just Western Balkans, but to much wider audience.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you, Dimitar. Thank you, Milan, for very, very interesting insights. And also thank you, our audience, for asking good questions. And since Milan already mentioned China, so I want to announce that our next live stream event will happen on 20th of May at 16 p.m. at 4 p.m. Riga time, and it will focus on disinformation in Southeast Asia, where we will present our upcoming report, which analyzes the disinformation in the context of elections in the region. So please stay tuned, and let's keep in touch, and we hope to see you back in one of our next live stream events. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.